Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of our video podcast. Today, we have quite a special episode, very special, I would say. We are joined by Dr. James White for an interview. He was kind enough to come on. So Dr. White is currently a research fellow at the Ural Federal University in Russia and a research fellow at the University of Tartu in Estonia. He defended his PhD thesis at the European University Institute in 2014 under the supervision of Steve A. Smith. His thesis was entitled Russian Revolution and Empire in Crisis, 1890 to 1928. He specializes in the history of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Old Belief, generally speaking, in the imperial period, and has published a range of articles on these subjects. He also has a podcast, which I can highly recommend to you, Tales from Imperial Russia. It's very nice. It's a good podcast. And today we will speak generally about the Old Belief, but we will mostly speak about his first book called Unity in Faith, Yedinovierie, Russian Orthodoxy and Old Belief. And one might say it's the first English, not might say, it is the first English language book on this topic. So, Dr. White, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for coming on. And I'll just thought we will start, asking something about you. Like, how did a British man or Englishman develop an interest, first of all, in Russia, then Russian Orthodoxy, and then in particular the Old Belief, and then the Edinoverie? If you could just take us through all of that.
No, sure. This is the most common question I get asked. I mean, I remember when I was in St. Petersburg researching Yedinovierie in the city archive. And when you go, I had to have a conversation with the director to get access to the archive. And she looked at me and said, "You're an Englishman who studies in Italy, who's working on Yedinovierie in Russia. So how did that happen?" I would probably say, well, from my undergraduate days, really, I was fascinated by Russian history. And I was always interested, especially the imperial period. And I was always interested in the Orthodox Church, largely because I was so ignorant of the institution. I just wanted to find out more and more if I could. And then when I started my PhD thesis, I really wanted to do it on Russian Orthodoxy. I mean, this one minor mistake in your introduction is my thesis was actually on Yedinovierie. It was called slightly different from the book title. Bridge to the Schism was the title of the thesis. But so initially I started working on a subject which was looking at the Russian Orthodox Church's reaction to toleration and freedom of religion after 1905. And so I was looking at sort of different areas in which the church had various reactions. So looking at it on an intellectual level, for instance. And one chapter I was sort of researching at the time was looking about this return of old believer property to the old believers and the church's sort of attempts to more or less to try and stop it between 1905 and 1912. And as I was researching this, bringing up archival documents about property seizures, etc., I kept on seeing this word repeated over and over again, Yedinovierie. What is this? I'd never heard of this term before. I'd been, in all my years of sort of reading about Russian Orthodoxy, I'd never heard of it. So of course, then I started looking it up. And I was like, okay, this actually looks interesting to me because there are big changes in this movement after 1905. Let's have a look. And suddenly I just realized, well, there's this huge amount of incredibly rich material stretching back more than a century to 1800 and even earlier on Yedinovierie. And then I wrote to my supervisor and said, look, I'm going to change my focus now. I'm going to do a thesis on the history of Yedinovierie by itself, not just simply as a chapter of a thesis with a different sort of central focus, but looking on Yedinovierie as a whole. And I mean, it still fitted in with my interest about toleration in the Orthodox Church, in that, Yedinovierie is a project which is born of the late 18th century atmosphere of the Enlightenment in Russia, both within secular society and within the church. And what you get to see, which is fascinating in the case of Yedinovierie, how this project, born in this enlightened, tolerant atmosphere in the late 18th century, transforms over the course of a century, how its internal dynamics and the dynamics from the rest of society transform it into something, each time into different permutations, something rather new. So I think that's probably my relatively brief answer on how I got interested in Yedinovierie.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting how we just stumble upon these subjects in academia. I mean, I had a similar experience when I was writing my works. It just like something came up, and I was, oh, this is interesting.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yes. I mean, this is my common experience. I mean, I would also say that I don't know if you call this part of my methodology as a historian, but I love finding these sometimes small, sometimes rather obscure cases. And then, not only just being the first person to look at many of these documents, but then also being able to write something that's truly original in terms of the scholarship, and also being able to bring out the wide implications of what people usually might dismiss as irrelevant or background detail and so on and so forth, and just bring it and bring out its greater relevance.
Yeah, certainly. And your work, it's not unique only because it's in English. I think I know from Russia that it's not been written a lot about it there. And I know from our common friend Father Evgeny Sarancha in Moscow, he told me that he's looking forward to reading the book, because even in Russia there hasn't been in Russian written about it. So it's unique in so many ways.
No, I mean, I think you're right. Consider, I mean, there hasn't been too much on Yedinovierie in Russia. I mean, I have to really mention my good friend and colleague here in the Ural Federal University, Dr. Alexander Palkin, who wrote a really excellent, thoroughly researched book on Yedinovierie. Truly, and in like my conversations with him over the last 5.5 years really helped me when I was turning the thesis into a book, because I only really got into communication with Dr. Palkin at the very end of when I was really in the last stage of preparing to defend my thesis. But it's truly an exceptional work. But still, this is probably the first real major work in Russian to have been since, I don't know, perhaps Father Simeon 1910 piece, really. There is a few other pieces here and there, some doctoral theses, for instance, which are quite good, but of course they're very difficult to access. You have usually to read a Russian doctoral thesis. You either have to know the author and they'll be willing to send you a copy, or you have to go to the State Library in Moscow to sit in the reading room, for instance.
Yeah, and from my own experience, I know, studying Old Believers, that a lot of the materials in Russian are very polemical. They're written by one side to justify their position. And I think even Father Simon, for us, Saint Simon, it's a bit similar. He's obviously defending his stance.
Sure.
So even if it might be good scholarly work, you always have it in your background while reading your book. And I see this as a compliment for you. Like, it's impossible for the reader to really find out what you think, what you adhere to, like in this book, what you would agree with. And I think that's one of its strengths, is that it challenges the reader to actually look at these things as how you present them, not just like, oh, I'm going to defend now the Yedinovierie or attack them. You just show things that you find. And I think that's really, really good.
Well, no, thank you. That's a really great compliment to me, because this is precisely what a historian should do. This is, especially an academic historian should do, is that, our primary goal is to reach an understanding of the phenomena we study. And I think it's also one of the reasons we are so passionate about our subjects is precisely the idea, is the intellectual curiosity of being able to look back into a past period with people who we don't necessarily agree with personally, whose cultures and lifestyles, mental outlooks are very different from our own, and try to get to understand what it is that was important to them, and how it was they acted, and why it was they acted.
Yeah, certainly for people in the West, I mean, non-Russian speakers, this book is really all they need for Edinoverie, because there's a lot of curiosity, especially online. People are trying to find these traditional means of practicing their faith. And, a lot of people, especially in America, they're like, I'm Orthodox already, let's become Edinoverie. And what does that even mean? And then they start to Google Translate a bunch of articles, and Vladimir Basenkov wrote a few articles in English, and then apart from that, it's like, so what is this thing? And I think you did a good job explaining it whilst remaining neutral, which, as I said, is very, very difficult. Justin, do you have any questions for Dr. White regarding this theme, or should we move on to the book itself?
We can move on to the book itself, I think.
Okay. or the topic of the book, I think, will be all over the place, I would think. So you already told us what inspired you to write about Yedinovierie and its relationship to the state. And could you tell us something about the early days of Edinoverie, how it started? Because in your book, you make it very clear how it started. And I think, I don't know if you agree, is it fair to divide the history of Edinoverie into 2 or even 3 parts? Would you agree with that statement?
So, I mean, if I can, there are lots of attempts to divide the history of Yedinovierie into parts, into exact chronologies. I mean, for instance, there's a short book by the Russian historians Korokin and Pavlova, I think, and they have an extremely strange way of approaching it, in that they divide this entire prehistory of Yedinovierie from the mid-17th century to the end of the 18th century into 2 periods itself, and then they consider the entirety of the 19th and early 20th century as one period. To me, this is quite a strange way of approaching it, especially because it homogenizes the 19th and early 20th century. And as I show in my book, there are real changes that are happening over the course of this period. I would be more inclined to say, well, basically, in the 18th century, you probably have a more singular story, which is basically, well, there are a few attempts before the 1760s to maybe offer some Cossacks in various locations the opportunity to use the 2-fingered sign of the cross, etc., in their services while remaining in communion with the Orthodox Church. But they rarely go anywhere, and they're not maintained for long, precisely because the Orthodox Church remains at this point very, very hostile to the idea of anybody using the so-called schismatic rituals. Then you had the change, of course, in the from the 1860s onwards, with most of the synod coming around, at least in theory, to the idea that you can use the old rituals. Very famously, Platon Lovshin, the future Metropolitan of Moscow, in 1767, writes the brief title would be The Exhortation to the Schismatics. This is a book which is actually, by imperial order, sent to every parish in the Russian Empire. And Platon basically says, well, look, we shouldn't allow rituals to divide us. And he goes through an exhaustive survey of the various ritual differences between Orthodoxy and Old Belief, and says, well, these don't relate to dogmas. These aren't matters over which we should divide. And then he brings up, more or less towards the end, well, perhaps we can allow, given what I've said, we can allow the old rituals back into the Orthodox Church in some capacity. And then begin the various attempts to create sort of longer lasting parishes, the first being in the 1780s. But what we notice here is, of course, that Platon, when it comes to realizing his ideas in practice and not simply in theory, he proves very, very reluctant to do so. I mean, he has real problems with Bishop Nikephoros' attempt to create a parish in Yekaterinoslav. I mean, I forget what it's called today in Ukraine. He also has problems with the other attempt going on more or less simultaneously in Chernigov or Chernihiv, also in modern Ukraine, where involving the priestly monk Nikodim. And it's very clear that what's the deciding factor here, why the parishes were created, well, it's because Prince Grigory Potyomkin, the morganatic spouse of Catherine the Great, the single most powerful nobleman in the Russian Empire, is basically very interested that Yedinovierie occur. And he's interested that Yedinovierie occur because he wants to use these old believers to settle the Russian Empire south, much of which had only just been conquered in the last few decades from the Ottoman Turks and from the Crimean Khanate. Well, I think I'm getting a bit off track here. I beg your pardon. Could I divide Yedinovierie into several periods? I would certainly say maybe you could consider saying something like, well, the various attempts until the 1760s, this sort of prehistory before the 1760s, maybe from the 1780s through to kind of the early 20th century, it's even difficult then to sort of say free periods, because I think you have so many permutations over this more than 2 centuries of development, really large scale changes in the character of Yedinovierie. I think to divide it into 3 periods is rather difficult.
Yeah, for myself, I was more thinking about, you point out very clearly in your book that, the thing that old believers were accused of, that they only adhere to one rite. You very clearly demonstrated that the Niconians, the state church, they did exactly the same thing. And in my mind, the 2 periods would at least be the time when they did that and the time when they stopped, right? Like, just very broadly speaking, of course. But that's more like their relation towards the old believers. And I think that's a very important point to point out, that they were both guilty of the same same fanatism, you might even say, right? That, it's only one way or the other one is heretical.
Yeah.
And when you read the history of the schism of the reforms, you very rarely get that picture. You get like, we blame the old believers, they are fanatics, but you did exactly the same thing, And I think that's you point that out in your book, and I was very happy to see that, because I had believed that for quite a long while, and even heard from Edinoverie in Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit difficult to use that as a sort of baseline for periodization. I mean, certainly on official level, by the 1880s, the synod is moving. Is moving. So in 1800, basically through the creation of Yedinovierie, Platon said, well, you can kind of have 2 rituals in the church. One is obviously less good, but you can, and we kind of have to put barriers in place to make sure that people don't make the mistake of wanting to, people who are already Orthodox don't make the mistake of wanting to use these rituals, but we can kind of have them. And then by the 1880s, the synod has said, well, actually now we're more or less willing to recognize de facto that they're more or less equal in the church. And we don't really have the same kind of problem of people transferring from one group to the other, from the Orthodox to Yedinovierie, or using one form of ritual or the other, so long as it's done within the church. But of course, then it's only really that view only gets, I don't know, theological legitimacy, maybe then from Metropolitan Sergei's pronouncements in the late 1920s, and then finally fully in 1971, when the local council of the Russian Church finally says, well, the anathema is abolished, the old rituals are absolutely not schismatic, they can absolutely be used. But of course, throughout this entire period, even as the synod moves towards legalization in the 1880s and afterwards, there are still people who are maintaining the older view. On the old rituals, who still maintain, well, they're semi-schismatic or somehow not as good, and a variety of reasons. I mean, you can still find this view between 1905 and 1917 among fairly prominent Orthodox churchmen. I mean, I'm thinking, just on the top of my head, there was a missionary who was working, I think, in the Northern Caucasus among with some Yedinovieres. I think it was among the Don Cossacks, actually. And they complained, well, he goes around saying, the old believer rituals are worth less, they're schismatic, and we shouldn't be using them, and we should be becoming Orthodox, not remaining within Yedinovierie. So this view never really dies, and as you pointed out, even today, there are Orthodox clergy who absolutely do not like the old Niconian rites, the pre-Niconian rites, sorry.
Yeah, even some bishops, obviously they can't criticize it the same way they did back then, but I mean, it's very clear that you have this discrimination, we might say, it still exists today. So it's definitely not gone. What I wanted to ask you was, when Edinoverie was created formally, one of the complaints we often hear from old believers that have not united with the state church is that it was a political tool for both parties. Meaning that even the old believers that join would not join so much out of faith, but because they want to be legal or, become legal citizens. Could you comment on that? And is that true? Did you find that in your research?
Sure. I mean, I think there are various issues here. So firstly, is it regarded as a political tool by the state? In which the answer is unambiguously yes, from its creation onwards. Basically, why is Potemkin and Catherine the Great, why is Paul I interested in doing this at all? Well, they want to find some way of bringing the old believers back under supervision, back making them useful to the state. The Old Believers are a large group. Many of their merchants are very rich and hold quite prominent social positions in some of the larger cities, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And well, the Russian Empire is modernizing, it's developing, it's expanding at a great rate, winning territories left, right, and center. Many of these territories are underdeveloped, and we need some way of using these Old Believers. Now, the problem, of course, is for the Muslims, Protestants, Catholics, whatever, the Buddhists of the Russian Empire, you can kind of legitimize their faiths and bring them under the government because they aren't really posing a direct threat to the Russian Orthodox Church, to the basis of the Russian Orthodox Church, or really it's the Russian Orthodox Church's flock. I mean, basically these faiths are located on the peripheries of the empire, and they're usually not trying to convert the Orthodox, generally speaking. Whereas the Old Believers, of course, are almost predicated on this rejection of the Russian Orthodox Church as legitimate, and claiming themselves to be the legitimate, the authentic representatives of Russian Orthodoxy. And so the state can never really legitimate them in the same way it can with the other faiths, to make use of these people's resources. It has to find a workaround, because let's remember the Russian Orthodox Church is in ideological support for the Russian for the imperial state. Then again, then you have Nicholas II's reign, Nicholas I's reign between 1825 and 1855, where absolutely Yedinovierie is a political tool directed against old belief. It's meant precisely as a way to undermine the old believers, to bring them in, to give them an option, an alternative to joining Orthodoxy. So absolutely, in that perspective, from much of that period, much of the 19th century, from the perspective of the state, Yedinovierie is a political tool. In terms of this idea of legalized old belief, well, this of course, and how do the Yedinovierie view Yedinovierie? Well, of course, for the majority of these people, it's very, very difficult to say. These are illiterate peasants who, when they do write their views, tend to convey their views, do so to figures in authority, so they necessarily change how they phrase things. When the people who write their petitions, for instance, are usually people, they might be the village priest, they could be the school teacher, the clerk, the local peasant clerk. And so they're phrased in very particular ways. Of course, it's difficult to say, well, how much does what was actually written in the petition reflect what they actually thought? And this is very difficult to say. Of course, we have some people like Ion Wachowski, who's a Yedinovierie priest in St. Petersburg, extremely radical opinions, who absolutely does argue that, yes, Yedinovierie is a political tool, and for that reason, we should abolish it, because it's nothing but hypocrisy. But from what I can see, is from my sources, is by the sort of early 20th century, there was a growing awareness that the reason many did convert to old belief, to Yedinovierie, or at least one of the reasons why they converted, was the idea that Yedinovierie was a place where people could legally practice the old rite without necessarily being threatened with various measures of coercion, various restrictions on their religious life. Because Yedinovierie was essentially part of the state church, was certainly not threatened with restrictions by the police. Of course, the Orthodox Church had its own restrictions, but so it was a more free area and a more legal area where you could practice old belief. And there's, I think I give a quote from the archpriest in Nizhny Novgorod in 1904, who sort of puts this very directly. This is why the old believers here like or will convert to Yedinovierie, is because they regard Yedinovierie as a legalized form of old belief.
So one of the things you mentioned is the changes as we come into the 20th century. Of course, yesterday was the feast of Saint Simon or Bishop Simon. Could you speak a little bit about him and about his role and his faction in changing what the Yedinovierie was, and maybe even a little bit about some of the other factions that were there at that time?
Well, certainly Father Simeon is, or Saint Simon, or however I should properly convey it, is a fundamental figure in Yedinovierie, to an extent because he made himself a fundamental figure by publishing just in such so much over such a short course of time, making himself essentially almost the main source for not only Yedinovierie between 1905 and 1917, the period where he's most active, but also his historical works. He wrote what is still, arguably an extremely comprehensive history in 1910, which was not based on archival materials, it has to be said, but certainly based on a thorough review of all of the published materials that he could get his hands on. And of course, was partially based on his own experiences as a Yedinovierie priest. So about him as a person. So of course, I may just give us a very brief biography for the sake of the audience. That he was born in Kostroma province in the I beg your pardon, I've forgotten the exact year, but in the 1870s. He was the son of a priestless old believer, the Grigory Shliov. Grigory converted to Yedinovierie a couple of years after Simeon was born, along with most of his family, most of the extended family, in fact, converted to Yedinovierie. This includes Shliov's uncle and some of his cousins and so on and so forth. After this conversion, very quickly, Grigory became a Yedinovierie priest, so went through the ordination, and then after some time in Kostroma, went to do where his career really flourished was in Nizhny Novgorod diocese, where I've actually did work in the archive of Nizhny Novgorod, and I actually did find some of Grigory Shliov's letters to the bishop, and he actually ran across some problems regarding Yedinovierie himself, in that he was once not officially reprimanded, but given a sort of slap on the wrist for allowing Orthodox people to believe they could convert to Yedinovierie. So in a sense, Grigory Shliov did actually encounter the kind of fundamental disparity between the mainstream Orthodox Church, if we can use the term mainstream, and Yedinovierie himself. In Nizhny Novgorod, Simeon went to the seminary, extremely capable and able student, which allowed him to do something which, to my knowledge, very, very few Yedinovierie clergy were ever able to do. Indeed, very few Orthodox clergy were ever able to do, which was actually to gain a place in the Kazan Ecclesiastical Academy. So this was the church's equivalent of a university throughout the 19th century. Extremely good conditions, extremely good teaching environments. And when Shliov was there, he made very clear what he wanted to do was to research Yedinovierie. He wrote his thesis, I suppose we'd say a bachelor's dissertation on the history of Yedinovierie, and that was what became later the basis for his book, in his 1910 book. While he was there, of course, this was the period, so this was the later 1890s, and he meets several important people. One is the Academy's long-standing and quite impactful rector, Antony Chlapowitsky, who becomes basically Shliov's long-term mentor and political benefactor. And he also meets there the Utomsky brothers. So there is the monk, later bishop, Andrei Utomsky, and his younger brother, Alexei Utomsky, who is much more certainly a very religious and convicted religious man, but someone who didn't see his career in the church after attending courses at the Kazan Ecclesiastical Academy. He went to Moscow university, where he actually trained as a extremely track-breaking physiologist. But in 1899, Alexei converts to Yedinovierie. He's probably the only nobleman who ever does convert to Yedinovierie. And I think it was 1911, 1912, he actually becomes the elder of Shliov's church in St. Petersburg. Skipping a little bit ahead there. So Shliov graduates from the Kazan Ecclesiastical Academy with quite high marks. And Antony Hakhovitsky immediately gets him quite a good position, the priest in Kazan's oldest Yedinovierie church. During this time, Father Simeon also does some missionary work. He goes with the backing of Bishop Antony. He's sent to do some missionary work, and at this time he seems to have quite good relationships with the leading missionaries. Of course, this is about to change. In 1905, you have the Edict of Toleration, very important changes in the Russian state, in Russian society, in Russian religion, especially with regards to the Old Believers. But at the same time, Father Simeon, again through the benefaction, from the patronage of Father Bishop Antony, is able to obtain a priestly position in St. Petersburg, again in one of its old historic Yedinovierie churches. And this is the Nikolskaya Church. I mean, you can go and see the building today in St. Petersburg. Today it houses the Museum of the Arctic and Antarctic, but this is a spectacular 19th century building. And it was truly a really wealthy parish at the time. And this was probably one of the most prominent social positions which a Yedinovierie priest could aspire to. And as of yet, Father Simeon wasn't, I think, was 30 or just under. So he was really a high flyer. Then in 1905, you have the Edict of Toleration, which basically says, one, you can convert away from orthodoxy to other faiths. So essentially makes apostasy legal, which it hadn't been in the empire before. And secondly, it basically legalizes Old Belief. It gives Old Belief most of the other privileges, that all the other non-Orthodox confessions of the Russian Empire possessed. So it could really come and have a public life again. And certainly they grasped this opportunity with both hands. The closed churches in the Logorskaya and Preobrazhenskaya cemeteries are opened with great deal of ceremony. You have a huge amount of Old Believer congresses in this period, Old Believer publishing houses open. There are, I think, at least 10 Old Believer journals which exist in some form or the other between 1905 and 1917. Not only in Moscow and St. Petersburg, there was even a journal published here in the Urals, which existed for a few years in this period. So really is a huge outburst of activity. But Father Simeon realizes there's a big problem with Yedinovierie, is that it's come from this period of the 19th century where it was used as a tool of coercion against the Old Believers. That has been essentially its raison d'etre. That's what it was used for, almost its purpose, especially as far as the state was concerned. And still, even after the most severe period of coercion has come to an end after the death of Nicholas I, while still the Russian Orthodox missionaries still believe very firmly that we should not really be reaching out to the Old Believers. What we want to do is defeat the Old Believers. We want to basically get them, break them out of existence, to defeat them. Whereas Father Simeon, in this new context, starts saying, well, Yedinovierie can no longer be used as a weapon of coercion because Old Belief is legal and it's no longer going to be persecuted. So something else has to be done with it. And he comes up with this new kind of idea, which is Yedinovierie is going to be a bridge to the schism. It's going to be a mutual meeting point between the official Orthodox Church and the Old Believers, where they can meet and have a mutual discussion and maybe, hopefully, in the course of time, come to a mutual decision about reunification, about forgetting the problems of the past and moving on. Now, but part of this problem is that Shliov sees is, well, Yedinovierie itself is under attack, he believes. Orthodox bishops, Orthodox priests, Orthodox missionaries in some cases are always attacking Yedinovierie. They're always trying to drive the old rite out. So we need to protect this unique heritage that Yedinovierie brings to Russian Orthodoxy, so that it can perform this new mission of being a bridge to the schism. How do we do this? So what Shliov proposes is really a really ambitious scheme of, firstly unifying all of Yedinovierie under a single national leadership. This is most of the time he believes this will be a bishop who acts under the synod for all of the Yedinovierie communities in Russia. Sometimes he changes his mind depending on the audience he speaks to and talks about a committee under the synod, but most of the time it's clear he wants a bishop. He also talks about forming sort of national congresses, national brotherhoods, religious fraternities, as a way of sort of gathering Yedinovierie together so they can, especially for the purposes of charity, to distribute charity on a national scale, distribute funds on a national scale, and various other sort of links between the positions. So, for instance, he noted, that the position of dean, this was the figure between the parish priest and the bishop. The Yedinovierie had their own deans since 1845, when Nicholas II allowed them to have them. But he noted, all too often is that Orthodox people are being appointed to this position. Orthodox priests are being appointed to this position. What we need this position should be solely held by Yedinovierie priests. And, I call this, I think it's a movement of centralization. It's almost a movement of uniformization. As that Shilov also sees, well, there are real problems with not just diversity on a geographical scale, but diversity has crept into how the old rites performed in these Yedinovierie parishes. And we need to start to work out a way of creating a single, concrete, unified old ritual liturgy. Of course, that would obviously would be extremely contested, and Father Simeon never really gets beyond sort of the very elementary stages of suggesting how that would go ahead. Factions against Shliov. So, firstly, this statement I've made, summary I've made of his beliefs, it really comes across in this petition he writes in 1905, almost immediately after the Edict of Toleration. So the Edict of Toleration is in April, the 17th of April, 1905. The petition comes in June or July of 1905, where he states these ideas, and he starts to publish articles based around them. Immediately in Moscow, a group of Yedinovierie, mostly grouped around the Troitskaya church and its attached Yedinovierie typography, the printing press, which was one of the richest Yedinovierie institutions in the Russian Empire, immediately come out against this scheme. So they say, well, we don't want this one bishop, for instance. We think this is, there's various canonical rules against this, but we also think this is too divisive. You're creating all these all these purely Edinoverie institutions almost to divide us from our Orthodox co-believers. So what they suggest as well, things like suffragan bishops, for instance. So that is the same. The diocesan bishop will remain Orthodox, but he can appoint Yedinovierie suffragan, or I don't know, vice bishops, you might say, to make it understand, deputy bishops, basically, who will then govern the affairs of Yedinovierie parishes in their dioceses. And this kind of debate goes back and forth for a couple of years. And it basically looks like that there was certainly a divide between what we can say were probably the St. Petersburg and Moscow Yedinovierie. Other parties, well, the Russian Orthodox missionaries, whom earlier in his life Shilov had quite a reasonable relationship with, at least on some level, have absolutely no toleration for this idea, for this sort of this new proposal that Shliov is making. They absolutely continue to see Yedinovierie is part of the Russian Orthodox mission. it can't have this much more autonomous, if that's the right word, life that Shlov is proposing for it. Its concerns should only be the success of the mission. There are no independent questions of Yedinovierie. I think one missionary I quote says, there are only questions of the mission and Yedinovierie's place within the mission. And of course, a bunch of the same concerns that have been raised over the course of the 19th century come back. Well, if the Edinoverie have bishops, then the bishops might go and flee to all the old believers and give them a legitimate hierarchy. Well, of course, this might make a church within a church and thus make a new schism. All of these are, of course, motivating factors, but for me, what I see most strongly is it's in some ways this is a matter of a turf battle. So the missionaries believe that they control Yedinovierie, they control its future fate and its purpose, whereas Shlov is proposing something different. So those are two major camps. Of course, we get occasional signs of Yedinovierie resistance to Shlov from other parties. So, for instance, between 1905 and 1908, he was involved in a long-running battle with his own senior priests in St. Petersburg. Shlov wanted to be elected as senior priest of his church. The current senior priest opposed this and had his own factions. And in the course of the running battle between the two, the opponents of Shlov, the head of their opponents was Archpriest Kastorsky. Kastorsky and his followers basically threw as much trash as possible at Shliov's ideas. And they also accused him of committing the political crime of not saying prayers to the Tsar. This was reported to the police. In reality, Shlov was very lucky that, of course, Kastorsky died when he did in 1908, because it might have got much more serious for Father Simeon. In 1912, there's many of his own supporters actually sort of have problems with Father Simeon's program, in that he tries to pass a parish regulation at the 1912 National Congress, which allowed the priests to heavily interfere in church finances. At the time, church finances were dealt with by the church elder, who was a layman, and the parish council under him. So by Father Simeon's sort of attempt to give the priest more role in the financial management of the parish, really angered many of his close supporters in St. Petersburg, who were precisely the people who were parish elders and members of the parish councils. So he could sometimes overstep. And occasionally we see other indications. So there was some Yekaterinburg Yedinovierie who wrote, I think it was in 1917, who said that Father Simeon is the second Ioan Wachowski. I mentioned before the radical who was excommunicated, and they really didn't want a second Wachowski. It's quite peculiar, actually, that Shlov almost purposefully identifies himself with Wachowski, even though Wachowski was a generally reviled figure in the Orthodox Church at this point, and their plans didn't really have much in their sort of plans and general idea about Yedinovierie didn't have much in common. So it was a bit of a political misstep. But even, I know I've been talking now for an extremely long time. So one more comment, which is something I didn't bring up in the book, because even some of the people who signed Shlov's petition in 1905 don't necessarily fully agree with him. So you can find, the petition is in the archive, all the copies that were sent back to St. Petersburg to Father Simeon. And under one of them, I can't remember where the parish was, but the priest the priest has signed the petition backing this scheme, but he writes down under it, well, we generally would like a bishop or bishops, Yedinovierie bishops in the Russian Empire, but we in our parish are very concerned because the Orthodox in our parish visit our church very often. They give us a lot of money. And actually, our parish is dependent on this money from these Orthodox believers visiting our church. We would like more assurances, please, if you can, that creating these Yedinovierie bishop won't divide us further from the Orthodox community. So even occasionally you get some flashes of insight from people who were generally on board with what his basic ideas, but were worried about the consequences. Again, I apologize for speaking at such great length.
No, please feel free to do that. This is an important topic, and especially in terms of Father Simeon, or as we would say, martyr Saint Simon. I think it's important that we really find out everything about him, the good and the bad. He was killed for his faith, and even our saints are not without fault. So this, I'm happy that you speak freely and feel that you can speak freely. That's very important. And I think what is very clear is that his reaction to 1905 was preservation mode, right? Was we have to survive. So he went very far in trying to do that. I would personally agree with some of the criticisms that he was basically establishing a church within a church. And I think that in modern times, this is the biggest argument against a Yedinovierie bishop. I think we will get to that in a little while. We'll ask about the modern situation, but it's certainly a very unique situation in 1905 when all of a sudden, like, there's actually no reason for you guys to exist anymore. I mean, you could see it like that. It might sound funny, but I mean, that's probably what many of the missionaries saw. And I just wanted to ask you to clarify, when Father Simon did missionary work when he was younger, did he do that among old believers or generally?
I think it was among old believers. I want to say it was Ufa. I'm just trying to recall now. I believe it was in Ufa, because Antoni Chlapowicki was bishop in Ufa for a brief period, while Father Simeon was in Kazan. And so I think he was invited by Bishop Antoni to Ufa. I mean, I'd have to double check, but that's where it was basically this period after when he became the priest. And he wrote a few things, I think, in some of the missionary journals in this period about his experiences.
Okay. Because, when you study Edinoverie, obviously the old believers who didn't unite with the church, they often, quite loudly and firmly say that it's basically like the Roman Catholic, Uniatism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I would personally say that it's not until maybe Bishop Simon, actually. That's when I see traces of that, trying to establish your own structure within the church somehow. So I can certainly see their accusations. Would you think that such an opinion and such a view that can be similar to the Roman Catholic Uniatism? Do you think it's fair, or from your studies would you disagree?
I think there are certainly parallels in how the Uniate Church develops and how Yedinovierie develops, and there's an extent to which you can sort of see how they come about. I mean, it's very, of course there are distinctions. I mean, it's very difficult always to draw one-to-one parallels between distinct historical movements. But, you can certainly see, well, why does the Uniate movement exist? It exists because the Roman Catholic Church wants to use it as a missionary movement against the Orthodox in places like Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which included parts of Ukraine. And of course, why does Yedinovierie exist? Well, it's meant to be as a missionary movement against the old believers. And basically, it's the same kind of compacts which they make both times. The Catholic Church as well. We can allow Orthodox rites into our church. They don't have to speak. They don't have to use the Latin liturgy, for instance, and so on and so forth. In much the same way, well, the Orthodox Church says, well, we can allow some old believer rituals into our church for the sake of easing this missionary struggle. And of course, there's some degree of you can see sort of how there are parallels in how the two develop. So for much of the period, the Orthodox bishops don't really like or trust the old rites or the people who use the old rite in the church. Much the same is true for the Uniates, is that the Catholic hierarchy does not particularly trust the Uniate Church, and often is maybe moving towards trying to push some of them into taking on the Latin liturgy, for instance, and the Western rites, etc., etc. And in the 18th century, you do see something similar to what happens in the Shliov. I mean, if you have the opportunity, I'd recommend Barbara Skinner's book on this. I think it's the Eastern front, the Western front of the Eastern Church, or something like this. But it's basically a history of the Uniate Church in the 18th century as it came under the control of the Russian Empire during the partitions of Poland. But she shows very clearly there's a process here going on where they're increasingly trying to create a kind of centralized Uniate authority, which is distinctly Uniate. trying to create a form of ritual standardization, because just like Yedinovierie, there was ritual distinctions in many individual Uniate parishes. And so, I mean, and so of course, I'm less familiar with the history of the Uniates of the 19th century, but even by the end of the 18th century, certainly, you're sort of seeing this evolution of the Uniates as a centralized, unified, more homogeneous kind of faith, or part of the Roman Catholic Church that had been previously. And certainly that was probably what Shliov wanted for Yedinovierie, in a sense. Although I should actually emphasize is many of Shliov's plans between 1905 and 1917 never actually come to fruition. He tries on multiple occasions to get the synod to pass these kind of regulations, but they never really manage it. It's only in 1917 when you have the Church Council come along, and as I really clearly say, the Church Council does not side with Father Simeon on most of the questions that are raised. It tries to forge a new middle ground.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's an important question, because in Old Believer polemics today, it's a hot topic.
Sure.
That it is Uniatism, and as you say, most of these things didn't come to fruition, mostly because of the revolution. I mean, as everything else in the church at that time, it just stopped, right? And
well, I mean, oh sorry, between 1905 and 1912, there are various attempts to put these proposals before the synod. So you actually had the attempt to create a church council between 1905 and 1914, a sabor, which the Russian Orthodox Church had been essentially denied by the emperors for much of the preceding 2 centuries. The last sabor in Russia had been, I think, in the the last local council had been in the 1690s, if I remember correctly. And there are various discussions about putting Yedinovierie reforms forward to the sabor between 1905 and 1914, because the problem is that Nicholas II never allows the sabor to convene in this period. He basically never decides one way or the other definitively. He sort of promises it in 1905 and then leaves that promise hanging in the air. And this is why the synod never feels that it can actually do wide-ranging, large structural reforms of Yedinovierie, because it was largely recognized by the time there had to be some changes. The rules of Platon, for instance, were clearly no longer fit for purpose. There was some idea, well, you could have some kind of bishops in the church. I mean, there wasn't consensus on which kinds you could have, but there was some kind of consensus that some bishops should be created, and various other questions about Yedinovierie life. But because the synod was basically hamstrung, it expected that there might be a council very soon. And so it didn't want to push through a radical, a large-scale reform, but the council then might simply say, well, we don't want that, we're having something else, and have wasted a lot of money and time and effort having put in this a reform program that was then quickly abolished. So, I mean, the revolution, of course, in 1917 is one reason why you never really see reformed Yedinovierie emerge. But of course, there were opportunities beforehand, which were mostly stymied by the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church was in many ways subordinate to the political goals, political aims, and political necessities of the Russian state.
So why, or what did the Edinoverie in the end do to convince the council to give them a bishop in 1917? Do you know any? I mean, do you know the reason, the compromise? Like how did the logic go?
So, I mean, the Council of 1917 was a very strange thing, because this is happening just after the February Revolution, when a monarchy has collapsed. But it's already very clear that the provisional government is very weak. And indeed, I can give you one, really very nice example, is they had meetings to discuss the abolition of the 17th century anathemas against the old rituals in 1917. But then the first session they had of those meetings, they had to close the session because the sound of gunfire and artillery shot outside in Moscow, where there was revolutionary fighting going on, riots on the street, meant they could no longer continue. So this is really a council that's happening in a moment of extreme revolutionary change, and that has a really substantial impact on what happens to the Yedinovierie reform moments in the council. For instance, the two people who are supposed to talk in favor of Yedinovierie reform, a Shlovian Yedinovierie reform package, which came from the second National Yedinovierie Congress in 1917 in Nizhny Novgorod. The two speakers were supposed to be Shlov, obviously, and Antony Khlyappovitsky. Antony Khlyappovitsky, however, was stuck in Kiev. He couldn't come back because essentially Ukraine was descending into the civil war, and he had gone to Ukraine precisely because the local metropolitan Vladimir Bogoylaviensky had been murdered. And so who replaced Metropolitan Antony, as he was at that point? Well, it was Bishop Serafim Alexandrov. Serafim Alexandrov. And Alexandrov had been a missionary not very long beforehand. He'd been Dmitry Alexandrov, and actually had been one of Shlyov's core opponents in the struggles between 1905 and 1912. And so what happens then is you have I think as far as I can aware on the council, entirely unique thing in the Yedinovierie sessions is that one of the two people supposed to put this program forward to the Orthodox Church Council is actually its opponent. What happens in the course of those meetings? Well, Father Simeon wants, at this point, he wants an almost entirely separate Yedinovierie episcopal hierarchy. He's no longer asking for just one bishop who might be under the patriarch. He's asking for a whole range of, I think the number 10 or 11 bishops. He is what he's asking for, and the creation of kind of Yedinovierie diocese within diocese, the creation of Yedinovierie educational institutions, which would be separate from the Orthodox ones, etc., etc. A separate Yedinovierie newspaper, where really the connection between the two, wings of the church, the Orthodox and Yedinovierie, would have been very, very minimal. Obviously, when this comes for the council, there are not many people who support this really quite radical vision on Yedinovierie's future. Most people say, well, what you're doing here is you're institutionalizing the old rite, and you're giving it an importance that ritual really doesn't deserve. Others are saying, again, this is going to be a church and a church, but also the atmosphere of the times comes in. At the time, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Imperial Russian Orthodox Church, is having real problems. The Georgian Orthodox Church, which had been part of the Russian Orthodox Church since the beginning of the 19th century, had declared autocephaly. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church looked like it might do the same. There were also similar discussions among the Estonian Orthodox about perhaps having some kind of autonomy or autocephaly. And so people like Bishop Serafim and others say, well, this program of Yedinovierie, this is for Yedinovierie episcopal hierarchy, is nothing more than a step to autocephaly. What they were doing, of course, was playing on the old slur there that Yedinovierie was a step to orthodoxy. So Shlov's plan doesn't really look like it has much chance of success. What they do tend to go for then is a much more moderate version, which is something similar to what had been suggested by Shlyov's Moscow opponents in 1905, was basically the idea, well, we can have Yedinovierie suffragan bishops, who are firmly subordinated to their Orthodox superiors. And we can have some of the other things you suggest. Probably it's not a bad idea to have some more Yedinovierie schools. Yedinovierie newspapers seems a more or less harmless idea. Some of these gets pushed through. But really, they're very, very clear. And these measures are passed, is that the Yedinovierie bishops, the suffragan bishops, will be absolutely subordinated to the Orthodox bishops. They won't have a right, for instance, to communicate with the patriarch independently of the Orthodox bishop. And indeed, the Orthodox bishop will be the person who decides whether his diocese needs or not does not need a Yedinovierie suffragan. He is the person who will petition the patriarch to create such a position. So why finally they allow these former bishops. Well, basically they put in a lot of safeguards to make sure they are completely under the thumb of the Orthodox diocesan bishop. Yes.
So basically they became bishops without becoming bishops. Ruling bishops, I mean, they became basically like vicar bishops or even honorary bishops without a see. Basically, they would just take care of a certain part of the diocese if the main bishop allows it. So,
yeah, sure, yeah. I mean, that's, and Father Simeon really lost his temper at when those points were put forward in the council. I mean, he essentially stood up and said, "We've worked for 7 days and it's all been in vain," and storms out of the meeting room. He doesn't wait to be thanked by the chair, and so on and so forth. And indeed, it has to be said, I'm aware, of course, he is a saint, but he's also a historical figure. His behaviour at the council was quite poor. I mean, he probably didn't do himself many favours. I mean, he was formally reprimanded by the chair of the session, who was Arseny Stadnitsky, 2 or 3 times for having insulted Bishop Seraphim and a couple of the other people present.
Yeah, it was certainly stormy times and a lot of emotions. I think that's very clear in your book, and you do a good job to show it in a way that is honest. So Justin, not Simon. I almost go Justin Simon. So Justin, maybe you want to ask your wrap-up questions, and then I'll do mine, and then we will allow Dr. White to rest.
Sure. So I guess kind of my wrap-up question, having studied the history of the Edinoverie from its beginnings up through this period, and I'm sure beyond this period, and probably through your context and everything of that study, you have an idea of its place today. What do you see as the state and maybe kind of role of the Yedinovierie in the Russian church today?
Well, of course, as neither a theologian nor an Orthodox believer myself, I try and keep my opinions on this to sort of a limited extent to sort of reporting what's going on. Because as far as I can see, what Patriarch Kirill is trying to do and has been trying to do since he was a metropolitan and in charge of the departments of the church's external Department of External Affairs, is to forge some kind of alliance with the old believers on social issues. He perceives, and to a large extent quite rightly, that Russian society today is quite secular, and he wants to try and present a united front together with the old believers in favor of, I suppose, a sort of attempt to re-Christianize, or at least make the Russian Orthodox Christianity more viable and more relevant to modern Russians and to modern Russian experiences. And that's where he sees some value, I think, in Yedinovierie, is it can be potentially a way of, again, taking something from Father Simeon in the early 20th century, this kind of notion of a bridge to the schism, as something that can help the Orthodox Church reach alliance, a treaty, an agreement to sort of work together on issues that they both churches or both groups share in common, have in common. Of course, Yedinovierie today remains very small compared to its earlier version, its historical, the preceding historical version. Whether, to what extent it will grow or not, I can't really say. I know, of course, today there is a lot of intellectual interest in Old Belief and ergo in Yedinovierie, and a lot of Russians have been, it's really since the 1980s, but have been rediscovering, their Orthodox heritage and the various questions that come with it. and there is a great deal of interest in old belief, and this is being reflected somewhat in sort of the revival of Yedinovierie in the early 21st century. I mean, if I had to say something, well, what of course is happening is Yedinovierie died off essentially from the 1930s onwards. I mean, it was wiped out by Stalin. I mean, there were very few parishes left that were operating. So the historical sort of the transmission of lived experience of the earlier version of Yedinovierie was broken. And what you're seeing today as well, it's something is being recreated in a way. And they're taking, of course, aspects of the Yedinovierie's history into creating this new movement. But of course, what has to be considered is those lessons that you're taking from early Edinoverie, they come with their own baggage. They were always contradictions, not in the various forms of Yedinovierie in the 19th and early 20th century. And perhaps if you you have to be careful when you're taking these lessons and bringing them into the early 21st century, that you're also aware of the contradictions inherent in them. I'm sort of commenting because you're seeing really some of the same dynamics that were present in the 19th and early 20th centuries start to re-emerge, and after the same debates, the debates have the same character, are coming out again. I mean, you know, you've talked on this podcast before about the sort of attempt to the asking of Bishop Ilarion to be a Yedinovierie bishop. And this kind of request is now being made fairly regularly. And of course, that is also bringing up many of the same accusations that it did beforehand.
Yeah, thank you. I think you pinpoint a lot of important issues, or vital issues, rather. You know, I think the term Yedinovierie comes with a lot of baggage, and we have to be careful. And we who are members of the church and old ritualists and so forth. I know myself, you know, for instance, the parish in the US, the Old Parish in Erie, they outright rejected to be called Yedinovierie when they joined the church in the 1980s because it had so much baggage, because it means so many different things to so many different people. And I think that that you make a very good point that in Russia today, yes, it is being revived, but it's still trying to figure out what it is.
Absolutely. Well, you know, today the word in Russian used for these parishes is a neologism. So they also officially are not called Yedinovierie parishes. They are called Stalobriadny, which is a different word from Stalobriadcheski or Stalovercheski, which is the terms used for the old believers. This is an entirely new word. Again, it means old ritualist. But, you know, it's a bit like if in English, I don't know, if instead of a Catholic, I said a Catholist or something like this. You know, it sounds quite awkward to the Russian speaker. So, of course, they are trying to a certain extent, distance themselves. And obviously, I don't think they want to sort of dig up the can of worms that would be calling themselves Orthodox old believers, because that was, you know, a huge problem in the early 20th century, which caused endless debates.
Yeah, and I think as well, I've seen a pattern. You know, some people that I'm familiar with who engage. I mean, in Russia, public figures who engage with Yedinovierie and somehow want to promote a new Russianness. You know, they somehow want to tie it to the national state of Russia, and this is the true Russia, and that has its own issues, potential issues.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this has been around really. I mean, in the second half of the 19th century, from about, you can see the beginnings of it in the 1840s, but it comes stronger and stronger as the 19th century goes on, is you have the cultural rehabilitation of old belief. Previously, it had been regarded, this is something of the dark masses, this is something of ignorance and stupidity. Well, no, what they start to say is simply because of the Slavophiles, who identified, you know, everything before Peter the Great was very good, and then Peter came along and wrecked it all by bringing Western reforms and so on and so forth. Well, who is a better representation of that than the old believers, who precisely have kept this kind of 17th century and older kind of piety separate and safe. And you certainly have people who are starting to say, like the novelist Pavel Melnikov, who wrote books about the old believers in Nizhny Novgorod, he writes a petition to Alexander II in the late 1850s saying, the old believers, the priestly old believers, they're the most Russian of the Russians. And this kind of view is really becoming quite acceptable. By 1905, you have priests in 1917, in Orthodox priests in 1917, in the Russian Church Council, who are saying the old believers are certainly more Russian than a lot of the westernized parts of Russia. So, they say, the old believers were certainly more truly Russian than Peter the Great, for instance. And this is what Father Simeon does very much with Yedinovierie. He starts to say, Yedinovierie is precisely useful because we've maintained this piety, this Russian this distinctive Russianness from the mid 17th century, before the Niconian reforms. And he himself was drawing, I think, a little bit here on what Verhovsky says about the old rituals, which was rather similar. And then, of course, what's been done today is that argument is being taken forward to quite a strong extent, precisely because Russian Orthodoxy is not simply a religion, a confession of faith in modern Russia. It's also a symbol of Russian culture.
Yeah, and I think, for instance, now the old believers who are outside the church, they commemorated, or even Edinoverie did, commemorated Avakum and his, I think, 400 years since his birth, or 450, or forgive me if I'm, and this was very much supported by the state. Of course, COVID happened, so they had to tone it down. But you have a bunch of new statues everywhere.
Sure.
So it's certainly being used, and it's being put up as a symbol of something. Let us see to what extent, and a symbol of what it becomes in the end. But it's surely becoming a tool for very different people with different ideas, I think. So it's yeah. I feel satisfied. And how about you, Justin? We can't hear you.
If I can unmute my computer. Absolutely. What you've said has been wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you. I mean, if I may, when I did watch your previous podcasts, and you mentioned at one point that you wanted to do a review of my book because you had disagreements on some points. I mean, I would love, as a scholar, I would always like to improve and listen to criticism. So if you have any parts you find, any comments or questions you have where you don't agree with what I said, I'd really love to hear it if we have time and we're not going to bore the audience to death.
We have time, and I think Justin was the one that said that. So Justin should now speak up.
Well, Justin does have a day job that he does have to get back to, so maybe later. So
yeah, because Dr. White was wanting to do it now. Honestly, for myself, I really like your book. It's not a criticism; it's just the fact that it's not a spiritual book, and it's definitely not a theological book.
No.
And again, it's not a criticism. It's just I try to make it clear to all people who I recommend it to, because I move in various circles, both academic and spiritual, and I think it's important to point out to people that this is not glorifying Saint Simon as the best thing in the world, or saying that Yedinovierie is flawless. I think it's an honest recount of what happened, and I see that as positive. Now, some people might be scandalized, perhaps,
sure,
but then they don't understand what the purpose of the book is, right?
I would agree with that. I mean, of course, as I said, I am a historian. I mean, that's the approach I take is to approach these things from precisely historical perspective. I mean, and I'm going to confess, I'm not a theologian. I've read enough to more or less understand what it is I read, but I'm certainly no expert. And I will say this: I'm absolutely no expert in Orthodox liturgics on any level. I mean, of course. So, and I hope I was rigorous enough to avoid mistakes on those questions. And of course, I would say there is a great deal. There is possibly a good research project in the future for someone who is an expert on liturgical matters within the Orthodox Church, to look at the history of Yedinovierie ritual, the way in which the liturgy is performed, because we do actually have a reasonably substantial basis of descriptions of these historical these historical performances of the liturgy in Yedinovierie churches, and we also have quite good sources for those moments when clearly different ways of practicing the old ritual clash with one another. As I mentioned, there was a lot of regional distinction between different Yedinovierie parishes and how they conducted the old rite. And it'd be interesting to actually, a professional liturgicist was able to sort of approach these kind of questions.
Well, I have a PhD in liturgics. So if you get the funding from Oral, I'll come over and I'll definitely be more than happy to look into it. But honestly, it is something that has to be done, and obviously maybe one day I could also contribute in some way. But it is a lot of work. It is a lot of work, but it's a good suggestion. There was one thing that struck me in the book, and not Simon. Why do I call him Simon? And Justin, if you have to go, then please feel free to go.
I probably have a few more minutes, but I do just want to say one thing in case I do have to duck out, that I absolutely agree with what was said about how wonderful the book is. And, even, you talked about taking the historian's view. I think that even as people who do view Bishop Simon as a saint, obviously, that studying that history is important, because a lot of times when we just read hagiography, for example, it becomes easy to forget that the saints are also historical figures and that they go through all the same sorts of things that we do, that they have tempers, they have things that, they, maybe would rather not have had personality-wise. And so I think that really getting this view of, that, the historical reality of this saintly figure is helpful. Similarly to, I think about, it was probably 15 or more years ago that there was a biography of St. John of Kronstadt that was published in English, that also, generated some controversy in Orthodox circles, because people were like, wait a second, this is showing that sort of human reality rather than the saintly image we expect to see. But I think that even though it can be possible to be scandalized by that on one level, that when we really look at it, that it is very helpful to see this, and we owe thanks to you, and gratitude to you for, helping us to have that resource, especially in English.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I think, of course, well, as somebody who stands outside the Orthodox tradition to an extent, but my personal comment would be, well, precisely, wouldn't we say that one of the reasons we can regard these people so highly is that they overcome their various personal flaws to achieve something far greater. In case of Father Simeon, Saint Simon giving so much towards Yedinovierie and really transforming its status within Russian Orthodoxy.
You spoke like a true Orthodox man.
Thank you.
And what I wanted to point out about the book, which I found very striking, is that very early on you adopt the way of describing things as, the state church and the schism. And I thought that was interesting, because that was one of the few instances where one could have maybe had a glimpse of your own opinion or something, because if Old Believers read it, they're like, we're not in this schism, what's wrong with this guy? So I think that was one of the spots where I was like, oh, maybe he sees them as a schismatic. Who knows? I don't know, but he calls them the schism, right?
I have to confess, I mean, basically, when I was so one of the reviews I got of the book said I should refer to them as the schism less and more as the Old Believers, precisely because the Old Believers don't regard themselves as schismatics; they regard themselves as the Russian Orthodox Church. If I do so in the book, sometimes it's usually because I've used the word old believer previously in the sentence. And I'm looking essentially for a term that can avoid simply repetition. I don't regard the old believers is schismatics beyond the sense that there was a schism between the Russian Orthodox Church and this other group. That's, you know, I certainly don't would say that I find I don't mean anything negative by using the term.
Oh yes, I mean it's clear you don't mean anything negative. I just meant that it was the only place that I felt like, okay, he took a position, or you could see it as that, but you clearly explained why. And
I think one of the, from my personal perspective, and if I was to research and rewrite the book again, I mean, I would like to try and do actually more of the old believer perspective on Yedinovierie, because really the perspective I take is very much Yedinovierie's process history within the Orthodox Church, in the official state Russian Orthodox Church, and their relations between the two. But of course, there is another story, which is precisely the story between the old believers and the Edinoverie. Now, the reason I don't speak so much about it in the book is because it's you have a very different source base, which is much more difficult to access. You have to look at things like, you know, handwritten pamphlets and so on and so forth from the 19th century. And there is certainly a source base there. It's simply nowhere near as kind of considerable as the archival documents, the printed stuff generated by the Russian Orthodox Church.
yeah, and also I think that the old believers are so divided and were at that point, like which side do you choose when you analyze? Do you priestless, which priestless, like priestly, which, you know, it's like there's so many aspects. So I think you could write a book about, you know, just Belokrinitskaya and Yedinovierie. Just that is one book, for instance, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's actually a kind of fascinating point, is that so the Belokrinitskaya's hierarchies archive is actually available online. It was entirely digitized, so it's normally stored in the Russian State Archive of Ancient Acts, you know, so called. But their entire archive font there has been digitized, and I actually did spend some time looking through it. You can see, you or any of your readers interested, I wrote an article about the Old Believer priests in the First World War, Old Believer chaplains in the First World War, which is based on this material from that archive. I have gone through some of it, not comprehensively, and it's quite interesting that I couldn't really find many references to Yedinovierie from the Belokrinitskaya hierarchs on the ground. They didn't seem to be overly concerned. Of course, from this archive starts about the 1870s onwards. So that's quite an interesting kind of sub story there that maybe needs some more working out to do.
Yeah, and I think it will be very polemical either way. You know, you would have to be very careful because there's, you know, for them, I think I might be mistaken, but if someone converts from the Russian Orthodox Church to Belokrinitskaya, the first thing they have to reject is not Nikon, it's not the reforms, it's actually Yedinovierie, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
For them, it's very, very, very sensitive. So yeah, but that should surely be done, and I really hope that, you know, more people will do things in English, whether that be small articles or whatever, because there is people want to hear about it. You know,
Sure.
they're fascinated by the topic.
Well, let's see. You know, it's early days still for my book. It only came out in November 2020, so, you know, I'm still waiting on the reviews from my colleagues. I hope they're as positive as yours, although I perhaps doubt it. But hopefully it will start to generate interest in the question among academics who can go and do this kind of research.
Yeah, and it also forces people within the church to reevaluate, because even as we spoke before, we still today have people within the main state church, so to speak, that look down upon the old right, not just Yedinovierie, generally speaking, you know, and they will see it as schismatics and even those that are in communion with themselves. Like there's this whole generation of priests and clergy that, you know, came up after communism that still have this old way of thinking, you know, that these guys they might leave whenever, we can't give them bishops because, you know, the bishops will establish a schismatic hierarchy, and this is everyday life for Yedinovierie today.
Sure.
Which is in many ways tragic. I mean,
absolutely no. I mean, I don't want to name. I won't name names, but there was a story I heard from a Russian friend who told me that it's sort of, I think it was the early 2000s, and there was a priest who was instructed to research Yedinovierie, an Orthodox priest who was instructed to research Yedinovierie by his bishop on the occasion of the anniversary of the church, which had once been a Yedinovierie church. So he went and did so, and then he learnt, which he'd never learned before, that the old rite had been used within the Orthodox Church since 1800s to an extent, and then fully legitimized in 1971. And so actually he went and started doing old rite liturgies in the Orthodox Church, for which his bishop then sent him out to a very distant rural parish as a kind of punishment. Of course, my suggestion is, well, maybe it wasn't so much that the bishop was angered by the old rites liturgies themselves, but rather that the priest had asked permission to do them in the church. But of course, what caused the investigation in the first place was the complaints from the other priests and from the laity who were observing. So of course, there's still, yes, indeed, there's still problems with using the two-fingered sign of the cross.
Yeah, and from a liturgical standpoint, we call it new rite, old rite, but there's a lot of study, and anyone who studies it seriously will see that it's one rite, and it's a different way of doing things, and that makes it even more comical when you have these people on both sides who anathemize each other for doing it a bit differently. Like the Latin rite is a different rite from the Byzantine rite. This is the same liturgy done a bit, so it all makes it just so much more tragic when you have bishops like that, or even priests who will be like, oh, you can't do that, but it's basically the same thing. Like not the same thing, but very similar, right?
Well, I mean, this is the the great tragedy of this story. It's the story of Old Belief, Yedinovierie, and Orthodoxy is precisely the break in the Russian Orthodox family, you could say, or the break within the Russian Orthodox Church, for reasons which now have been recognized as largely superfluous and not particularly well based. And in the course of that split, you had the tragedy of the late 17th century, people hunted down, tortured, executed. The period of Nicholas I, where priests were sent in exile in chains to Siberia, or priestless officiants, prayer houses torn down, icons taken, books burnt. Of course, this is the truly great tragedy of it all.
Yeah, it really is, and we also in this sad story see how the influence of the state can help the church, but it can also doom it, and I think we have to be careful. We have to learn from these lessons going forward, we as everyone.
No, I agree. I think it's I think to an extent the patriarchate has to be a bit careful today, but I won't go any further.
Surely there has to be a balance. Okay, we could probably go on for hours.
Indeed.
But maybe we can do it some other time. I'll try to get Justin to find some negative things, and maybe we can have you on again. But honestly, I recommend everyone to get this book. We'll put the link in the description. You can even buy it digitally, downloaded, for people who have an issue, getting things from Amazon. So I really recommend it. So thank you again, Dr. White, for coming on, taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a great. It's always a great pleasure to talk about my work, and as you can hear, I tend to go on a bit in quite a long-winded way when I get the opportunity. So thank you for giving me that opportunity.
That's perfect, and you probably have much more to say. So maybe we'll figure out a way to get you on again. But in the meantime, thank you all for joining us, and again, Dr. White, thank you, and all of you take care and stay safe.